welcome everybody. This is a webinar on restorative justice and VOCA. Is being recorded and it will be available on NJJAN's website in the next day or two. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Pryor, our Executive Director now.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. And hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. We're super thrilled to have you all with us, with Jessica and Ann, to talk about VOCA and restorative justice. But before I introduce them, I just want to give a quick background on the National Juvenile Justice Network. We lead a national movement of state youth justice advocates, all of whom seek to shrink our youth justice systems and transform the remainder into systems that treat youth families and victims with dignity and humanity. We currently have 53 organizational members across 43 states and DC, plus about 50 plus graduates from our Youth Justice Leadership Institute, which is a leadership program for people of color in the youth justice advocacy space. So we are, again, thrilled to have Ann, Seymour, and Jessica. I'm going to give them some super quick introductions, and then they're going to launch in and talk to us about what VOCA is, how it's set up, what it means for your state, and then Jessica is going to talk about what she did in Tennessee to move those VOCA dollars towards restorative justice programming. Ann Seymour is a national advocate for crime victims and survivors, specializing in criminal and juvenile justice and restorative justice, crime victims' rights and services, and community safety. She's 35 years of experience. First as Director of Public Affairs for the National Office of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and from 1985 to 93 as the co-founder and Director of Communications of the National Victim Center. She's worked for 10 years on criminal and juvenile justice reinvestment initiatives in over half the states, and is Director of Fairness, Dignity, and Respect for Crime Survivors Project. Jessica Barfield is the Assistant Director at the Tennessee Office of Criminal Justice Programs, which functions as Tennessee's strategic planning agency that secures, distributes, manages federal and state funds for Tennessee. As Assistant Director of Programs, Jessica leads 13 program managers providing programmatic oversight and project implementation assistance to agencies statewide. In this position, she also served on OCJP's strategic planning team, where she has brought new funding ideas to Tennessee, including HABIT, a human-animal therapy intervention, and restorative justice and culturally specific training opportunities, which are being launched this year, which we're going to learn about. She's also served as Tennessee's VOCA administrator prior to this position. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Ann, who's going to lead us off.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, and good afternoon and good morning to folks on the left coast. I want to just say I'm really happy to be part of this webinar, and also working for many years with the National Juvenile Justice Network. I do appreciate their good work and certainly their interest in victims. On the next slide, I want to talk to you about our goals for today. Okay, well, let me start by saying that my little background with Jessica is her amazing work in Tennessee. Not every VOCA administrator has opened up with full heart to restorative justice. She's going to talk a little bit later about the work she's doing, but she and I did a presentation to VOCA and compensation administrators a couple months ago that was super well received. So that's kind of like how we got together on all this. Today, what I want to do is I want to describe to you what the Victims of Crime Act, VOCA, it's also called the Crime Victims Fund, what it is, and Jessica's going to talk to you about its application to restorative justice. I know a lot of you are very familiar with restorative justice, but I want to talk about core principles of what we call survivor-centered restorative justice. We have a pretty significant article being published in Corrections Today in January that is about these core principles. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the types of restorative justice programs that incorporate the specific services that are articulated in the VOCA rule. Everything, as you know, related to the federal government, there's rules that go along with it. And Jessica is going to talk to you about the major change that now allows for RJ programming. And I'll go to the next slide, please. Um, VOCA, it's Victims of Crime Act, was sort of a game changer in the victims assistance field. It was passed by Congress in 1984, and it established what we simply call the fund. It is not taxpayers' dollars. That's the most important thing that we like to brag about VOCA. It's derived from fines and fees that are levied against convicted federal offenders and lower level offenders. Everyone's charged, I think, $50. But when you hear about the, $500 million fines against major corporations, those go into the fund. And a few years back, Congress, in its wisdom, because there were really large fluctuations in collections, they established a cap that stabilizes ongoing funding for victim and survivor services. Some people love the cap, some people don't. I think it's probably a pretty good idea to make sure that we have sustainability with funding. And we'll go to the next slide. VOCA 2019, this is what's being proposed, and I don't know that anything is going to go through in the lame duck section, but this year we're talking about 2.3 billion, that's with a B, that will go into states, and also with set-asides for the Violence Against Women of Act. Many of you are familiar with that. It's almost $500 million now, fully funded by VOCA. Vision 21 is the Office for Victims of Crime in the Justice Department. That's kind of their discretionary programs at the federal level. And I was really pleased. A lot of set-asides this next year proposed for Indian nations, which I think is long overdue. They're also proposing to set the future annual VOCA cap at $2.3 billion and also limit deposits to $2.5 billion. And again, what the administration and folks are trying to do is really to make sure there's enough money every single year and that we don't run out, which would be a really bad thing. There's a great handout for you that you all have somewhere floating in webinar land, but just know that VOCA funds a lot of diverse programs, both system-based programs in law enforcement, prosecutors, but also when you look at rape crisis center, children advocacy centers, MAD chapters, battered women shelters. These are all things that are funded by VOCA, and we're starting to see funding of RJ programs, which Jessica is going to talk about. Go to the next slide, please. I want to just talk pretty briefly about, y'all are familiar with restorative justice, and for me, it's just really important that we get restorative justice right when we're talking about crime victims and survivors. And I want to do a shout out to Dr. Sandra Pavelka. She's my co-author on the article we have coming up that I mentioned earlier. She's a professor at Florida Gulf Coast University and was really big on BARGE back in the 90s. So real quickly, y'all can read. I'm just going to run through the crime is personal and it hurts people. It's sort of a no-brainer, but it's worth repeating. Restorative justice really has to have the survivor at the center of everything, and restorative justice practices have to be trauma-informed. That means having an understanding of literally the mental psychological pain that results from victimization, both acute and chronic. The voices of survivors in restorative justice are you can't do restorative justice without engaging survivors. And I can say one of the programs that Jessica is funding, they in Tennessee has an incredible survivor council, and I would just encourage you to make sure you have victims advising you. Victim autonomy has to be central. That means if the victim does not want to join in a restorative justice practice, that they will not be coerced into doing so. And at any time during a program or practice, the victim wants to opt out, that's got to be just fine. And same, that's just something that's really, really important to the victim assistance field. The other thing is that you need to make sure that you understand victims' rights, because you've got to reflect and respect them through your programming. And I'm not going to give you the long tutorial, but basically victims have the right to be present and heard and informed and treated with dignity and respect, and to have reasonable protection. And that sort of has to be at the core of what you're focusing on. And the last one that I think is really important, it's not said enough, is that so many people who are justice involved, including kids, women and men, have histories of trauma and victimization that can be addressed within a restorative justice framework. And I will tell you that looking at trauma and victimization, looking at state ACE scores, there is a pathway to corrections to prison that starts with trauma and victimization. And we have to really be aware of that. We'll go to the next slide. Traditional questions. Traditional justice asks what law was broken. Restorative justice gets way personal and says who was harmed. Traditional justice, who broke it. Restorative justice, again, very focused on individuals. What are their needs? And traditional justice focuses primarily on punishment. You know, what punishment can we mete out? And restorative justice is quite different. It looks at the obligation of people to meet the needs of folks who are involved in restorative justice practices. A whole different paradigm shift, and one that I really like. Next slide, please. A little bit of history of restorative justice. It has been the dominant model of criminal justice through most of human history, and I think we need to recognize that. For a lot of people, oh, it came around in the 90s. Yeah, it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and is a foundation in many countries for their justice systems. New Zealand being the one that comes to mind. In 1996, the Justice Department did a national symposium on restorative justice that I got to tell you freaked me out, because the things that were said to victims and about victims were let's just say they weren't in keeping with the principles that I mentioned earlier. So being an outspoken victim advocate, I was asked to kind of help better define restorative justice to be more survivor centered. So we ended up we called it the Restorative Justice World Tour all over the country, and literally trained thousands of people on restorative justice practices, some of which we're going to talk about later. Today, I'm really proud to say that programs that I've been involved with, and Jessica will talk about hers in Tennessee, they really engage the community. They focus on the survivor and his or her needs. And something we're not really good at in the survivor assistance field is rigorous evaluation. And when Jessica speaks, you're going to see that I think one of the best things about her RFP was the evaluation strategy. And today there's a potential for VOCA funding for restorative justice. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. And later is now. Okay, Jessica.
Do you want to pick it up here, Anne?
Sure. Do you want to talk about the rule?
Sure.
Okay.
So VOCA rule has just changed recently in the past, I think, year and a half. Maybe it was 15 that it came out. I'm not sure the exact date. But they provided a little more flexibility on what VOCA would allow funding for. And restorative justice was one of those programs that they basically allowed for funding for it. And we were very pleased to see that, especially with the increase in funding that came into states. In particular, our state, we went from one year to the next in about a little over $30 million. So we were able to get some innovative programs, fund new agencies, and with restorative justice now being an option, that allowed for us to kind of go out with an RFP for that. So as you can read, I'm not going to read it to you, but it's basically keeping the crime victim at the center. It's meeting with the perpetrator. It's making, as Anne said earlier, it's making sure it's trauma-informed, victim-centered, and that the victim's needs are always at the forefront. So again, the safety and security of the victim. You want to look at the costs versus the benefit and therapeutic value. Many victims may not be ready to therapeutically be ready for a restorative justice program. So they should be evaluated and talked to and make sure they understand the full program, and at any point are allowed to pull out of it if they don't feel comfortable. And they should have that therapeutic services wrapped around them during the process. And then debriefing after each meeting, no matter how small they think the meeting was, the victim should be debriefed after every time they meet, and then given a kind of a heads up on what the next meeting will be and when and where, and kind of keep them in the part of the process the whole time. And then you want to look at the credentials of the facilitators. They need to be credentialed, they need to be informed about restorative justice, they need to know what the process is, and how to keep the victim at the center. So where Tennessee is now, we went out with we call it a VOCA solicitation. Most of you know it as an RFP, so I'll use that term. We went out with an open competitive solicitation, RFP, for funding for juvenile restorative justice projects. And we went out with that in January of 2018. Those projects just started this July. They were for $200,000 for federal funding per year, and requiring a $50,000 match, and those were 3-year terms. And we provided them with a scope of service, a project narrative, to guide their program implementation. And so we gave them some goals and objectives and activities that we were kind of requiring them to do, but we allowed them to add to that to make sure it was specific to their program and agency. But that is what we hold them to as part of their contract. And that our open solicitation, our RFP, and the scope of service has been included for your reference. So it's, like Ann said, it's out there in webinar land somewhere. We decided that we would go straight from what the VOCA regs were saying, and that the project should be victim voluntary, victim centered, priority given to programs that were utilizing evidence-based models, and the activities must demonstrate a clear understanding of a victim-centered and voluntary approach to restorative justice. So these are, this was an example of a goal and then the objectives that we provided to them on their narrative, and then asked them to provide their additional ones. And as you can see here, it's basically right off of what we would think of a voluntary, victim-centered restorative justice program would be. It was to promote the healing through voluntary restorative justice, and then the 2 objectives were to increase the victim's understanding of their victimization and how it has affected them, and then to decrease the intensity of the crime-related symptoms that they may be having. We encouraged collaboration by saying it was strongly encouraged, and we put that in the solicitation. We were hoping to get MOUs, letters of support, so they showed community involvement in their project and community backing for that. Part of the scope of service has required VOCA outcomes, and these 5 are the required ones that you have to evaluate and collect data on as a VOCA project. And then there's additional ones. These are the ones that are optional. So you have to do the 5 that I just had on the screen, and then you have to pick an additional one, and these are the optional ones, but you must pick one of them, and then you must collect the data on that. We also allow for them to add as many other outcomes if they wish, but we require them to collect that data and report it back to us as well. So in Tennessee, we went out with the RFP. We had 6 applications that we received back. We decided to, through our review team process, we have an external review team that scores all of the applications, and then we get the review team together to discuss priority of funding and how much, depending on how much money was asked and how much money we have set aside for this solicitation. And we received 6 applications. We funded 3 through the review team process, and then we moved another application from another solicitation that we had opening to the restorative justice funding pool, because their project made more sense to be restorative justice, and we worked with them to make sure that they understood what restorative justice meant, and that they felt that their project aligned with that as well. So we ended up funding these 4 agencies in Tennessee. We did not fund 3 of them because they did not have a restorative justice model, or they weren't victim-centered, or it wasn't voluntary. So it was either the court was mandating them to do it, and so that meant that the victim really didn't have an opportunity to say they didn't want to be involved, and so those were just kind of automatically ineligible for funding. And so these are the 4 that we decided to fund, and I'm going to go through each one of those and what their project is and what they're doing in the community. So Gideon's Army is our first one. They are working with 14 to 25-year-olds, and they're usually referred by a school counselor, the court, or the police. And referred is the key word. They're not mandated to do it. They're referred to Gideon's Army for a restorative justice program if they would like to be a part of it. Gideon's Army takes a public health approach to violence through a multi-sector partnership, community building, violence interruption, emotional trauma care, skill building, circles, and community conferencing. And so the community conferencing and the circles is what the restorative justice program that our office is funding for them. They have healing circles, family circles, peace circles, and formal conferencing. They also have an added piece to this project that we are not currently funding, but they are getting funding elsewhere as for violence interrupters. And those are the real-time, on-the-street people that are responding to the real-time crime crisis in the community. And so once the violence interrupters are on scene, they can work with the victims and the community at large, and then later on they can bring them into the organization if they want to move forward with the restorative justice project.
Wow.
The Nashville Conflict Resolution Center, the name probably speaks for itself. They are working with 8 to 18-year-old offenders, and they're referred by the juvenile court, schools, police departments for violence cases. So school neighborhood fights, domestic assault, threats, harassment, bullying, theft, vandalism. Those are all the types of cases that they're being referred. They focus on young people from structurally disadvantaged neighborhoods, and they are characterized by disproportionate poverty, violence, and incarceration rates. So the goal of their project is to avoid exclusionary school discipline and further juvenile justice involvement. They develop the skills, de-escalate the violence, deepen their positive sense of community, and successfully complete school. And it fosters resiliency and accountability in the young participants. And their project is called a restorative meditation project. The next one is RAFA Institute, and I'm sure Ann will touch on them a little bit more. She's actually herself, Dr. Kilpatrick and Dr. Pavelka, they're all contributing their time and expertise to RAFA as an in-kind contribution as part of RAFA's match to this project. So Ann is very involved with them. They actually competed in a highly competitive process for the Restorative Justice Pilot Project through our juvenile court here in Davidson County in Nashville, Tennessee. They have an MOU with the Davidson County Court, the Davidson County District Attorney's Office, Metro Police Department, and the Davidson County Public Defender. So all 4 of them have got together to start a restorative justice project here in Nashville, and RAFA Institute was the chosen organization to put it together. They are getting referrals for home burglaries and car thefts perpetrated by the youth. So instead of charging them, instead of charges being filed, they have the option of a victim-focused, evidence-based restorative justice process. All parties are referred to the RAFA Institute for voluntary participation in the restorative community conferencing. And they are one of 9 other pilot sites nationwide sponsored by Impact Justice. You'll learn, I think we are still going to talk a little bit about them later in the project with Ann. But they're seeking to plan, implement, and evaluate the overall effectiveness of the restorative community conferencing and circles for crime survivors, youth offenders, and the families of both and their communities. So they have the research evaluation piece added to this project. They're trying to validate a victim survivor needs assessment instrument, and that's the part that Ann and Dr. Kilpatrick and Dr. Pavelka are using their in-kind contribution to. So that is a very exciting program for Nashville, and also nationwide if it validates an assessment and it can be used across the country. The last one is You Have the Power. This is the one that we moved into restorative justice funding because it made a little more sense for their project. It is, however, not as, it can be interpreted as not being as victim-centered as the other projects because it's a young adult impact curriculum project. And so we're focusing on the victim, which is also the offender, if you will. So they have a past history of victimization, but they have recently offended. So it's not a traditional restorative justice project because they're not meeting actually with the victim, but we are addressing their prior victimization. It's with a young adult impact curriculum. It's a highly interactive 8-week program. The goal is to help youth offenders and victims empower themselves, to examine cultural norms, accepted labels, and healthy communication as a means to own their experiences, train and reinforce actions and results, and then understand ACEs, adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and how it impacted their life and how it continues to impact their life, and try and get them back on the right road, if you will. Most of the participants are going to be coming from low to mid-income, high crime communities exposed to violence on a regular basis. So they are basically living in trauma on a day-to-day basis, and we are hoping to have an impact on them and turn their lives around. And Anne, I think this is where I turn it back over to you.
All right. Yes, thank you. And I want to say, Jessica, I'm like your biggest fangirl. I think what you're doing in Tennessee is just phenomenal. And my hope is that every VOCA administrator makes the same types of decisions that you've made. So, which leads me to 3 important considerations. We don't have a Jessica in every state. And I say that because every state administrator gets to make their own decisions about funding priorities. And most of them are made through pretty rigorous statewide strategic planning. I'm actually heading up to Delaware after this webinar to help them with trying to figure out how to spend the money. So having said that, it's really important to know your administrator and educate them about restorative justice programming. I mean, one of the things to do, I would suggest, is have, link them to this webinar when it's archived, and let them know that we spoke quite proudly of what's going on in Tennessee, and there are actually a number of other states that are also funding restorative justice. So there's a link there through the National Association of VOCA Assistance Administrators, and we have to do a shout out to its director, Steve Doreen, who we call Stevie Wonder. He's got a link that can take you right to the website of your state VOCA administrator. And, Jessica emphasized, and I have to tell you, the reason I love the programs she funded, when you write a grant and you're like, oh, we're going to kumbaya with all these people, restorative justice requires partnerships, not just cooperation, not collaboration, but what they're doing in Tennessee is really engaging community and system people and victim folks together in permanent partnerships. And so as you look to think about seeking VOCA funding, don't even consider doing it unless you've got partnerships to build on. We'll go to the next slide. We're going to just talk quickly about some restorative justice practices, and Jessica gave you a really good overview of the ones that she's funding in Tennessee. I'll throw a few more out there, and I'm going to kind of go through these quickly so we leave time for questions. So she mentioned restorative community conferencing, and that's what the RFA Institute is doing with support from Impact Justice. And if you go to the next slide, community conferencing is it just offers a way to address youthful wrongdoing with kind of a goal of reducing recidivism, but also, as Jessica emphasized, really increasing victim satisfaction, and also seeing, victim trauma be reduced, and again, increasing community involvement through partnerships. We'll go. So the process, and this is what I've learned from Impact Justice, but also working in Davidson County in Tennessee. You get a case referral from the juvenile justice system, and there's pretty intensive preparation of each party for the conferencing. And like any good restorative justice practice, it involves the youth, the victim survivor. Both of their families are representatives of people who are like families to them, and community members. And basically, after addressing the needs of everyone involved, you come up with a plan that, I like to say, it provides options and opportunities, both for the victim survivor and also for the youth. And then hopefully with really good supervision from a program like the RFA Institute and the juvenile justice system, the youth would be able to complete the plan successfully. We'll go to the next slide. It's very survivor-centered, and I will tell you, I sort of watched conferencing grow over the last 20 years to be very focused on the victim deciding whether or not to participate. Do they want to ask questions? Who speaks in what order? Definitely having the capacity to talk about the impact of the offense. And I think about what they're doing in Tennessee. I mean, people think, oh, it was only a burglary, it was only a car theft. There are a lot of survivors who will tell you that their lives were wrecked and these seemingly minor crimes put them on a trajectory of just hell and trauma. And finally, the most important thing is that the victim really gets to decide what's important to them in terms of the plan and making sure that the plan is followed. We'll go to the next slide. Opportunities, there's a consensus-based plan. I know it sounds weird to say, but anything that allows survivors to have pretty serious self-reflection. My experience, and again, working over 20 years specifically in the juvenile justice system, a lot of victims want the kid to turn his or her life around. They want that person to quit harming other people. That's like their number one thing, and they want restitution. So being able to look at those things from a victim-centered approach is really important. And the other thing is, focusing on accountability is a core tenet, I think, of restorative justice, but also in terms of being victim-centered. Not going through the juvenile justice system, you can still hold a youth accountable. I think in some with restorative justice program even more so. And very often these conferencing is part of diversion. So if the kid successfully completes it, they do not have blemish on their record, which I fully support. And we'll go to the next slide. I've been bragging about Impact Justice. So they don't provide training and technical assistance, but they have really good resources. And they've done some great studies on restorative conferencing. So if you visit impactjustice.org, they're going to load you up with some great resources. And we'll move on to, I think, victim awareness classes. Let's go to the next slide. Y'all are probably aware, I mean, the victim impact panels were started by Mothers Against Drunk Driving years ago, and they moved on to youth corrections in the juvenile justice system, and then into adult corrections in the adult criminal justice system about 25 years ago. We'll go to the next slide. So we'll go to the next slide. You can see I'm rushing through these so we leave time for questions. The whole idea of victim awareness classes, the woman who really broadened it out in the California Youth Authority in the 80s was a woman named Sharon English. Her mother would help. So she was a juvenile corrections professional and also a survivor. And yeah.
You're cutting out a little bit. I'm not sure why.
Can you hear me? Oh.
Yeah. Maybe let's try again. Keep going.
Okay. Sharon said, if we can teach a kid to spell refrigerator, we can teach him to spell restitution. And her whole focus was really coming up with an educational format where initially it was incarcerated youth, and now, of course, it's broadened out. And so the Office for Victims of Crime, it's one of the favorite projects I've worked on. They created a curriculum that has 13 units built around the core crime topics, from property crime, as Jessica discussed, all the way to homicide. It's packed, shelf ready to go. It includes a DVD with vignettes of victims talking about their experiences. And if you've not tapped into this curriculum, please do. It's one of the things that, again, like I said, I'm most proud of having worked on. But also, if you want to do victim awareness as a component of any of your programs, this is your go-to resource. Next slide. I'm going to go quickly through these. Again, very victim-centered. Y'all are going to get tired of Jessica and I saying that. That it really does focus on what we call the power of the personal story. And y'all know, going through the juvenile justice system, it's really impersonal. And impact classes make it highly personal. And also, as Jessica mentioned, there are opportunities for the kids to talk about the trauma in their lives. It recognizes that anyone can be a victim of crime, and that victimization has a real far-reaching ripple effect. The whole idea is, as I said earlier, a lot of survivors, and especially the ones who speak at victim awareness classes, they want the kids to change their thinking and change their behavior. And as I said earlier, really focus on having an opportunity and an obligation to make amends. And next slide, please. Keep going, if you would, Miss Jessica. Restorative community service is something that I am proud to say I actually helped develop back in the 80s, which tells you how old I am. I got really frustrated seeing, kids picking up trash along and don't get me wrong, that's, if that's what you got, that's what you got. But we started talking to victim advocates and they realized there was a lot of stuff that we could have kids do for community service projects that are visible in the community and viable to the community, where there's positive adult role models, not just the juvenile probation officer, but people like victims and victim advocates who are providing support in community service endeavors. And we'll go to the next slide. So restorative community service, it's basically through the pre-sentence investigative process. You ask the victim, do you have any ideas for, would you like the kid to serve community service, the youth? And if you do you have any recommendations? And the other thing is that in a lot of communities, they have collaborated with victim service agencies. I love to point to Bend, Oregon, where they literally had youthful and adult probationers build with Habitat for Humanity. They built a couple of houses for domestic violence survivors. It doesn't get any better than that. I can say here in DC, we have kids do our stuff related to Crime Victims' Rights Week and Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So they kind of get their work contributes back to the work that we do as victim advocates. So that's my quick explanation there. We'll go to the next slide. And just, I like to give people websites because we're running through this stuff quite quickly. There's a group called the National Association of Victim Advocates in Corrections. And they've done a lot of work. They do an annual conference that focuses on victim offender dialogue. And these are the programs in state prison departments that are funded by VOCA in a number of states. And so I would encourage you to look at their 20 principles of victim offender dialogue. And then a couple of other things that are becoming increasingly popular are apology banks. Sometimes a victim wants an apology, didn't have an opportunity to get one. Sometimes someone who is incarcerated or under community supervision wants to give an apology. And something Jessica said earlier is, I'm going to reinforce it. We should never, tell a kid to turn around and apologize to your victim. We should never force a victim to accept an apology if they do not want to. So if you go to these two websites on this page, really super good resources for structuring apologies within the juvenile justice system. And I think I think it's Q&A time.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jessica. I'm going to share my webcam again. And can folks hear me okay? Yeah. Jessica, you might want to share yours. There you are.
Here I am.
So just a couple housekeeping. I know a lot of folks have been asking whether they can have a copy of the PowerPoint. And Jessica, is it all right if I load that up into the resources?
Yes, could you correct the word? Could you correct the footer that I spelled national wrong? I'm so embarrassed.
We will correct that and load it up. And if folks don't know what resources we're talking about, there is a little, in your control panel, there's something called handouts. And right now, there are 4 different handouts for you. And I'm just going to tell you super quick what they are, and then we'll get this PowerPoint loaded up there as well. We've loaded in from Tennessee the grant solicitation process for what Jessica put out for folks to respond for the restorative justice programming, and the scope of services, which details some of the outcome measures, if I'm not mistaken, right, Jessica? And then we have 2 publications from NJJN. One is basically a tip sheet on VOCA for youth justice advocates. So for youth justice folks who were not used to sort of thinking about VOCA, understanding what it is, it talks about what VOCA is. It talks about how much money, from 2016, so the money is a little bit, it's not up to date, but it's generally accurate. Talks about how the money flows down to the states and what some of the changes in that VOCA rule, which I think came out in more or less August, September of 2016, what the changes in the regs mean for youth justice advocates in terms of thinking about those VOCA dollars. And the second publication is hot off the press is from NJJN. We just cleaned it up today. And it looks at where we sit on rolling out a number of restorative justice papers. One we rolled out last year, or just this year actually, on New Zealand's experiment in restorative justice and what lessons we can learn from that, and that's found on our website. But this is looking at restorative justice with a sort of anti-racist lens. And if we think of restorative justice as a transformational process, and we're committed to building a society that is not racist, what does that mean in terms of thinking about restorative justice? And so we sort of put out, you know, we want to be anti-racist, we want to end racism. How can restorative justice get us there? And what are 10 questions to think about as you're implementing a restorative justice program if you want to move it to be transformational? So that is also in the handout, and again, we'll put up that PowerPoint. And I see that there are questions, which is great. So I'm going to field them. Given how many people there are on this call, we're not going to unmute people because I've just seen how tricky that can be. So apologies for us translating your question, but you can feel free to jump back in. Wow, so many questions. So this is, I'm gonna triage some of the questions. So this one says, I thought I read that you cannot use VOCA funds to treat, quote, offenders as victims, but that last project Jessica detailed did use the funds that way. Is that allowed?
So it depends on, the answer is it depends, which is a lot of answers with VOCA. It depends on what you're focusing on. So this is an impact class, and it's focusing on the victimization of the person who happens to be an offender. It's not focusing on the offense, if you will, that took place to make them an offender. It's working on the victimization that they've had prior. So as long as it's separated at that point, you can still use victim funds to have programs for offenders, as long as it's focusing on a victimization that they've had. If that makes sense. So it's not, if you've ever been an offender, you just can't have any VOCA funding or be a part of a VOCA project. You still have to relate it back to a victimization, and the project has to be working on helping that person with the victimization that they had. And in Tennessee, I like to say this: if we can justify a project to fund, we will justify it. And then if the federal government, we should probably not put this on the web, I'm just kidding. If they come to us, as long as we can justify the project in terms of relating to the VOCA regulations, we will look to fund it. And we will argue and we will back and support that project if we are questioned about it, giving them the justification that we came to when we decided to fund something.
I'm gonna go to another question. Says, I'm due to begin working with youth in Northern Ireland who are part of the juvenile justice system. And the question here is, what is the one thing you've taken to a system that is particularly hostile to youth who engage in these behaviors? So how do you do this work with a system that's hostile to young people who engage in these behaviors?
And I'm going to leave that one for you, because you've probably had more experience in the field with the different programs you've developed.
Oh, I'm back. Sorry. Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay.
Did you hear the question?
No, I literally, my audio got cut off completely.
Yeah.
I think this is a question for you.
The question is sort of programmatic, and it asks, but it's also a system level question. The question is, what's the one thing you would take into a system that is particularly hostile to youth who engage in these behaviors? So how do you do restorative justice within a system that's hostile to young people who commit criminal offenses?
Well, I will tell you, get a victim survivor advisory council, and I don't just suggest people do it because it's a victim sensitive thing to do. very often people they think they know what victims want. And I think what we have found in Tennessee and in a lot of other states is, as I said earlier, victims want accountability. They want the kid to change behavior, and very often restitution is really important. So having victims to be able to, to do focus groups, to do roundtables, to advise the juvenile justice agency about what victims think and need becomes a really important part of that. And I will tell you, I've done it in a number of states, and it's been extremely, I think, surprising to the juvenile justice agency, and also very, it's a wonderful thing to hear victims' voices.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to jump in with a question on behalf of the NJJN members, who I know often or may not necessarily be connected with their VOCA administrator. And I know you talked about the importance of reaching out and building a relationship. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of more details about how to build that relationship and how to reach out to your state's VOCA administrator to start having a conversation about restorative justice.
Well, I'm going to let Jessica answer that too, but I'll give you the example. Heading up to, I do strategic planning with VOCA administrators in a number of states. And again, in a number of states, Pennsylvania, Delaware, the ones that I've worked in most recently, New York, they engage, the juvenile justice folks I make sure they're always at the table. Now, like we said, every VOCA administrator is unique, but just being asked to be involved in strategic planning sessions, and I'll let Jessica talk about what they did in Tennessee. Get on their mailing list so you sort of know what's going on. Show up to meetings. Victim people love our meetings. We just love having meetings. Show up and have a one-pager about what you do. I feel like we still neglect the juvenile justice system more than the criminal justice system. That's my opinion only. So y'all can help us change that and be out front there. And Jessica, you did great work in Tennessee with your outreach, and you've got 4 funded programs now. Maybe you can chat about that.
Well, our strategic planning process is a yearly process. We have strategic planning meetings that we attend, community meetings that we attend. All of our program managers are kind of out there in the field at some point or another, being a part of different meetings, and we take notes on that, and then we bring it back to what we call a round table. And at our round table is kind of where we really sit down and look what has happened throughout the year, what notes we have taken, what people are saying the needs are out in the community. And we sit down with, we call it the Noah's Ark, because we have 2 individuals representing the different disciplines, victim services, law enforcement, prosecution, judge, public defenders. All of those people come to the table that we invite, and we discuss different topics and what is out there, what is needed. And restorative justice came about because of one of those meetings, because they were looking for other options for juvenile justice instead of just the punishment and the disciplinary actions. And they thought there was more that could be done and more that is needed for the juvenile justice system. And so that's how this kind of project became about. To answer the question specifically, I would reach out to the VOCA administrator or the office that the VOCA administrator is at, ask to meet for coffee, ask to just come up there for a meeting, introduce yourself, what you do, ask them about their strategic planning process, and if you can be involved in that, and that you're passionate about what you're doing, and you just want to know what's going on in the state, and as it pertains to VOCA. And I think just getting your foot in the door and building that relationship, hopefully they invite you to the table to be a part of their process.
Oh, great advice.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. We have a question here about when restorative justice is being offered as an option within the justice context, like it's being run maybe perhaps by justice agency or for a young person who's being referred from justice or like Department of Probation. And so the question is, sorry, I had it and lost it. So what do you do when an agreement isn't completed? So there's some sort of an agreement that's established in that process, but there's a time limit. Maybe there's 60 days. In this case, it's a 60-day time limit, 60-day window.
Right.
So what are the options then when you got that sort of that structure, that criminal justice structure laid on top of it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm really big on extending conditions of the agreement. Very often in conferencing, let's say that you gets in trouble again, which is something that, you don't throw them out of a conference process. They're the ones who need it. Very often restitution isn't paid in 90 days. And so that's another reason. So to be, as I like to say, fluid and flexible, and to be able to extend the conditions while still keeping it, whether it's part of probation or becoming part of diversion, which is the route that I really recommend.
Yeah, I would say it probably depends on who was the referring source of the person, because it's probably going to be, if it was a judge, it's going to be their and what to do with it. But to bring to the table the option of extending it would be probably the recommendation, as long as all parties are willing to agree to that.
Oh yeah, I forgot to add that. Yeah.
I gotcha.
If folks have any other questions, you can type them in. Otherwise, I think we are. Here's one more question I'm going to pop in here. We have another minute. See if we can get it in. What are I think this might be for Jessica. What are the offenses that might disqualify a youth for being eligible for participation in a restorative justice process? I'm guessing it's for Jessica's programs, because otherwise it's a program dependent question. You have 4 programs, so I don't know.
A lot of our programs are very specific on what type of offenses they allow, because especially the RAFA Institute restorative conferencing, community conferencing, they are only doing home burglaries and car theft because they are doing an evaluation piece, and it's a pilot project. So they're very specific on the types of crimes that they will allow. Others are, I would say, probably to start the least violent or the most violent would probably not eligible for the process. It just all depends on the type of project it is and what the credentials of the people that are performing the project and what they're comfortable with. So like the restorative mediation project, I think it says violent cases, but it's not. It's like school and neighborhood fights. Domestic assault is probably one of the most violent ones that they have listed on there, but threats, harassment, bullying, theft, and vandalism, I think it's the people that are involved need to have the background knowledge of what they're getting into with the crime. So I think it all is dependent upon who the agency is that's doing the project and what the project involves.
Yeah, and I just want to quickly add, some of the departments of corrections actually use VOCA funding to support victim offender dialogue in serious violent cases, like we're talking homicide and rape, but very, very victim driven and very structured. And the other thing is, like, victim awareness classes and circles are also in juvenile corrections agencies. But again, it just needs a lot more structure and planning when you're dealing with violent crimes. Very different dynamic, if you will.
And I would say most of the time those are not going to be held in community-based organizations.
No,
those will be held in the jails and prisons with professionals and housed in there.
Yeah. If I can jump in, there's one more question that just came in that's important for this webinar, actually, because it's about the use of VOCA dollars for restorative justice. And I think I know the answer, but I want to get it on the record. The question is, can you use these VOCA dollars for programs, restorative justice programs that use surrogate victims?
Yeah. I would, my interpretation of the VOCA rule, if it follows all the other guidelines, is yes. The OVC model, and go look at the victim awareness curriculum, we talk about surrogates or stand-ins for the victim. Again, it's following the VOCA rule. And the other thing, the most important thing, is every VOCA administrator, please don't go tell them that Jessica and Ann said, because that's going to get us in trouble. They all have discretion, so it's really selling them on your program. And I would say surrogates are just fine.
Yeah, there's the victim impact classes that Anne was speaking of. Most, if not all of the time that they bring in victims, it's not a victim of anyone in that class.
Right.
The victim is a victim of someone else, of not one of the offenders in the class.
Yeah.
So I know that we're just past 3. So I think we're gonna close out, and apologies to folks who have additional questions. You can email them in, and if Anne and Jessica have time, we can try to get you answers. If you email them, it's email to info@njjn.org.
And they have our email on the our emails on the last slide.
Oh my God, they might just go directly to you. It's too late to load up those PowerPoint slides into the resources because this is going to close down. But in January, when we load up this webinar to our YouTube channel, we will also email out to everybody, if not before, the PowerPoint slides. I want to super huge thank you to Anne and Jessica for spending this time to talk with us about this. So important and really, really helpful to all of us to think about how to increase the use of restorative justice, how to and how to fund it. So this is really helpful. Deep gratitude to you guys both. So thank you, and thanks to everybody for attending.